The Wayfarer screamed through atmosphere it was never designed to handle, every rivet and seam protesting Marcus's desperate attempts at controlled flight. The instrument panel looked like a Christmas tree designed by someone having a panic attack, warning lights in colors Marcus didn't remember existing, alarms harmonizing in ways that suggested the ship's computer had given up on prioritizing crises and decided to just report everything simultaneously. "Come on, baby," Marcus muttered through gritted teeth, fighting the control stick as another solar flare surge hit the upper atmosphere and turned the air around his ship into plasma. "We've made it through worse. Granted, I can't actually remember when, but I'm sure it happened." The planet below was designated Kepler 1847c in the Colonial Survey database, which was the universe's way of saying, "We found it but couldn't be bothered to name it properly." Marcus had been mapping the system's outer reaches when the solar storm hit, massive, unexpected, and thoroughly uninterested in his flight plan. His options had been stay in space and let the radiation cook him, or dive for planetary shelter and hope the atmosphere provided shielding. He was currently reconsidering that decision. The crystalline formations rising from the planet's surface caught the storm's energy and turned it into cascading light shows that would have been beautiful if Marcus wasn't actively crashing through them. He pulled up hard, barely clearing a tower of what looked like geometric quartz grown to impossible heights, felt the ship shudder as the slipstream tore off another piece of hull plating. "Landing gear," he called out to the computer, which responded with a tone that Marcus chose to interpret as "You're joking, right?" The gear deployed anyway, mostly, and Marcus aimed for what looked like a relatively clear valley between the crystal formations. The impact was everything a crash landing should be: violent, chaotic, and significantly more successful than dying in space. The Wayfarer carved a trench through crystalline undergrowth, shedding components and dignity in equal measure, before finally grinding to rest against a formation large enough to stop even her momentum. Marcus sat in the sudden silence, broken only by the ping of cooling metal and the distant rumble of the storm, and conducted a quick personal inventory. Arms, functional. Legs, probably fine. Pride, thoroughly destroyed. He'd survived, which put him ahead of several possible outcomes. The ship systems reported their status with the enthusiasm of a teenager asked to clean their room. Main power offline. Communications impossible through storm interference. Life support functioning on backup, but unlikely to last more than a few days. The emergency beacon was broadcasting, but signals weren't getting through the electromagnetic chaos. Best case, rescue would arrive once the storm cleared in 36 to 48 hours. Worst case, Marcus had supplies for 2 weeks and a very boring death ahead of him. He unsealed the cockpit, grabbed his emergency kit, and climbed out into the alien landscape. The crystalline formations surrounded him like a frozen forest, each one pulsing with bioluminescence that responded to the storm's energy. They hummed, a sound felt in his bones rather than heard with ears, creating harmonics that made the air itself seem to vibrate. "Well," Marcus said to the empty landscape, "this is officially the weirdest Tuesday I've had in at least a month." He was surveying potential shelter options when he heard it, a sound that didn't match the wind or crystal resonance. Something that might have been a voice, might have been his imagination, but definitely warranted investigation because sitting alone in a crashed ship making optimistic predictions about rescue was a poor survival strategy. Marcus followed the sound through the crystal maze, climbing over formations that had collapsed recently. The fractures were fresh, still glowing with residual energy. The storm had done this, he realized, toppling structures that might have stood for millennia, rearranging the landscape into something more dangerous. He found her in a small clearing where several formations had fallen like massive crystal dominoes. She was pinned beneath one of them, partially visible through the debris, and Marcus's first coherent thought was that his day had just gotten significantly more complicated. She was humanoid, close enough that his brain initially categorized her as human before the details registered. Her skin shifted through subtle color variations like light through opal, catching the crystal glow and reflecting it in patterns that seemed almost intentional. Her bone structure was more angular than human, elegant in ways that suggested different evolutionary pressures. And her eyes, when they focused on him, were large and luminous, purple, he thought, though the light made it hard to be certain. She wore clothing that Marcus's exhausted brain labeled as formal. Elaborate layers that might have been beautiful before being shredded by falling crystal, patterns and symbols that suggested significance he couldn't interpret. One arm was trapped beneath the crystal at an angle that made Marcus wince in sympathetic pain. Blood, darker than human blood but recognizably blood, stained the crystal beneath her. She spoke when she saw him. The language was musical, carried by vocal cords that produced harmonics human throats couldn't match. Her tone suggested questions, maybe warnings, definitely pain. Marcus didn't understand a single word, but he understood the situation just fine. He held up his hands in what he hoped was a universal, "I'm here to help" gesture, pointed to her, then to the crystal pinning her, trying to convey intention through pantomime since language had failed them both. Her response was surprise, eyes widening, her free hand moving to her chest in what might have been shock or might have been some cultural gesture he didn't know. She spoke again, slower this time, and Marcus caught himself trying to lip-read an alien language because apparently his brain had given up on useful strategies. "Okay," he said, keeping his voice calm and level despite knowing she couldn't understand. "Let's see what we're working with here." The crystal was massive, easily several hundred kilograms, balanced precariously on two smaller fragments. Marcus circled it, looking for leverage points, trying to figure out how to move something that outweighed him by a factor of 5 without killing them both in the process. The woman watched him with those luminous eyes, occasionally making sounds that might have been encouragement or might have been warnings. Marcus wished desperately for his translator, which was currently crushed under a collapsed bulkhead back in his ship. He wished for proper equipment. He wished for literally any advantage beyond determination and a concerning willingness to attempt stupid solutions. He settled for improvisation, using smaller crystal fragments as levers, jamming pieces into gaps to create purchase. Marcus worked in silence except for occasional grunts of effort. The physics were terrible. He was essentially trying to build a functional machine out of debris while working against gravity, time, and his own limited strength. But 15 years of fieldwork had taught him that most impossible problems were just difficult problems wearing intimidating labels. The breakthrough came when he managed to wedge a particularly solid fragment under the main crystal's edge and used his own body weight as counterbalance. The structure shifted, not much, maybe a few centimeters, but it was movement where there had been none. The woman understood immediately. She tried to pull herself free despite obvious agony, her face, because the expressions were readable even though the features were alien, twisting with pain and determination. Marcus dropped the lever and grabbed her, pulling her the rest of the way out just as his improvised jack failed and the crystal crashed back down. They ended up in a heap, both breathing hard, her blood staining his environmental suit. Marcus did a quick visual assessment. Broken arm definitely, possibly broken ribs, lacerations that needed treatment he wasn't qualified to provide, and a concussion if the dazed look in her eyes meant what he thought it meant. "Okay," he said, pushing himself up carefully. "Okay, you're out. That's step 1. Step 2 is not dying from those injuries, which means we need to get back to my ship." She said something in response, her musical language sounding strained. Marcus had no idea what she'd said, but her tone suggested either agreement or resignation. He looked at the sky, where the storm was building again, looked at her injuries, and made a decision that was either heroic or catastrophically stupid. He was going to carry her back to his ship. She couldn't walk. That was obvious from how she couldn't put weight on her right side without crying out. The storm was intensifying. Staying in this collapsed crystal grove was suicide. So Marcus carefully maneuvered her into a rescue carry, trying to support her injured arm, avoid putting pressure on possible rib damage, and maintain balance on uncertain terrain. She made a sound that might have been protest. Her free hand gripped his shoulder, surprisingly strong despite her injuries, and Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settle onto him like a physical thing. He had no idea who she was, why she was here, or what he was getting into. But she was hurt and he could help, and sometimes that was enough reason. "Here we go," he said, starting the trek back toward his crashed ship. "Try not to die on me. My paperwork is already going to be a nightmare, without having to explain alien casualties." The crystalline formations pulsed around them like a heartbeat. The storm built overhead with the kind of determined inevitability that suggested the universe had opinions about his survival. And Marcus carried a stranger through an alien landscape, because it was the right thing to do, even if it was probably going to complicate his life considerably. 3 hours. That's how long it took Marcus to carry her back to the Wayfarer, and by the time they reached the cargo bay, he'd memorized exactly how much a life could weigh. His muscles screamed protests in languages his brain was too exhausted to interpret. His back had submitted several formal complaints to his spine, and his legs were operating on what he could only describe as spite-based locomotion. The woman had drifted in and out of consciousness during the trek, occasionally murmuring in her musical language, once gripping his shoulder hard enough to hurt when he stumbled over hidden debris. Twice he'd had to shelter behind larger crystal formations, while energy discharges turned the air around them into plasma that made his suit's radiation warnings extremely agitated. But they'd made it. Marcus got her into the cargo bay, the only section still holding pressure and heat, and immediately started triaging her injuries with his medical kit. The broken arm was first priority, and he carefully said it while talking to her in English she couldn't understand because the sound of a human voice was supposed to be calming, and he desperately needed something to feel productive. "This is going to hurt," he said, manipulating the bone into alignment. "I'm sorry about that. If it helps, I have absolutely no idea if I'm doing this correctly for your physiology, so we're both in uncharted territory here." She stayed conscious through it, watching him with those luminous purple eyes, her face showing pain but not panic. Marcus applied his kit's smart splints, adaptive technology that would adjust to whatever bone structure it encountered, and moved on to the lacerations. The wound sealant was designed for human tissue. Marcus used it anyway because the alternative was watching her bleed, and that wasn't acceptable. Her blood was darker than human, almost violet in the cargo bay's emergency lighting, and it clotted differently but seemed to respond to the sealant. He hoped that meant compatible biochemistry rather than just good luck. The possible rib injuries he couldn't do much about except avoid putting pressure on her right side, and hope that rest would do what his limited medical knowledge couldn't. He demonstrated shallow breathing, pressed gently on his own ribs to show what he meant, and felt ridiculous doing charades about not dying. Through all of this, she watched him. Not with suspicion exactly, but with an intensity that made Marcus self-conscious. Like she was cataloging every movement, every expression, building a file in her head about what humans were like based entirely on a tired survey captain performing field medicine he was barely qualified to attempt. Once she was as stable as he could make her, Marcus set about making the cargo bay livable. He dragged in supplies from other sections, emergency rations, water containers, his spare emergency shelter. The portable generator provided heat, though he had to position it carefully to avoid overloading the bay's already stressed systems. The woman watched all of this from where he'd propped her against the bulkhead, her luminous eyes tracking his movements. When he offered her water, she examined the container with obvious curiosity before drinking. The relief on her face transcended language barriers. Thirst was apparently universal. He offered food from his ration packs next. She approached it cautiously, tasting with the wariness of someone who understood that alien biochemistry could make eating dangerous. But whatever her species' nutritional needs were, they were apparently compatible enough with human rations because she ate slowly, methodically, never taking her eyes off him. Marcus ate his own rations while sitting across from her, the cargo bay filled with the hum of emergency systems and the distant rumble of the storm. This had to be the strangest first contact scenario in exploration history. No protocols, no diplomatic teams, no carefully orchestrated introductions. Just two people who couldn't communicate trying to figure out how to coexist in a damaged ship while waiting out a storm. He tried names, pointing to himself. Marcus. Then to her with a questioning inflection. She seemed to understand, responding with something that sounded like Silthara or possibly Silthara. The phonemes were close enough to human speech that he could approximate them, but different enough that he was probably mangling the pronunciation terribly. She didn't correct him, just made a gesture that seemed like acknowledgement. They developed a primitive communication system over the next few hours, gestures, demonstrations, simple concepts conveyed through pantomime. Marcus showed her his damaged ship systems, pointed to the communications panel that was receiving nothing but static, tried to explain about storm interference through hand-waving and pointing at the sky. She seemed to grasp the situation. She retrieved something from her waist, a damaged device that looked like crystalline components integrated with organic circuitry. Completely dead, whatever had damaged it thorough in its destruction. She showed it to Marcus with an expression he interpreted as frustration, then tapped the side of her head and made a sweeping gesture. Couldn't contact her people either then. They were both stranded, both isolated, both dependent on time and rescue that might or might not arrive. It was oddly equalizing. Whatever political or social differences separated their species, right now they were just two survivors waiting out a storm. Silthara, he was committing to that name in his head now, started showing signs of exhaustion. Marcus set up his emergency shelter properly, gestured for her to use it, tried to communicate through demonstration that she should rest. She resisted initially, her body language suggesting she didn't want to be vulnerable in front of a stranger. But pain and exhaustion eventually won over caution. She accepted the shelter, settling into it with careful movements that favored her injuries. Marcus took first watch, monitoring his ship systems and keeping an eye on his unexpected guest. She slept fitfully, occasionally making sounds that might have been distress. Once she cried out and woke herself, and Marcus found himself moving closer, speaking quietly in English because the tone mattered more than the words. "You're safe. Just a nightmare. It's okay." Silthara stared at him in the darkness, her luminous eyes reflecting the emergency lighting, and something shifted in her expression. Not trust exactly, but perhaps the recognition that trust might be possible. The storm raged for 48 hours. Marcus and Silthara settled into a routine, tending injuries, sharing rations, attempting communication through increasingly elaborate pantomime. They played improvised games to pass time. Marcus would point to objects and say the English word. Silthara would respond with her language's equivalent. Neither could pronounce the other's words correctly, but they tried anyway, and their mutual terrible pronunciation became a strange shared joke. When the storm finally cleared enough for Marcus's emergency beacon to start transmitting, he showed Silthara the communications panel lighting up with confirmation signals. She understood immediately. The universal language of rescue is coming, apparently transcending species barriers. Her reaction was complex. Relief was there, obvious and genuine, but also something that might have been concern or apprehension. She spoke then, a longer statement than any she'd made before, her tone formal and weighted with meaning Marcus couldn't decipher. She touched her chest, then his, then pointed upward, toward space, toward their respective peoples. It felt like she was trying to tell him something important, maybe making a promise or issuing a warning. Marcus responded the only way he knew how. He touched his chest, then hers, then nodded. Whatever she was saying, he was acknowledging it. Whatever came next, they'd survived this together, and that had to count for something. In orbit above the planet, both human and Viren rescue vessels were converging on the emergency signals. Neither knew yet what their arrival would reveal: that the human pilot had been sheltering the most important person in the Viren Star Empire, or that this accidental first contact was about to reshape diplomatic relations in ways no one had planned for. But in the cargo bay of a crashed survey ship, Marcus and Silthara waited together in comfortable silence, two strangers who'd kept each other alive through shared determination and improvised kindness. Whatever came next, they'd face it having learned each other's names, having shared rations and shelter, having demonstrated that sometimes the most important communication happened without words. The Steadfast arrived first, a human frigate whose appearance through the thinning storm clouds was the most beautiful thing Marcus had seen in days. The Viren vessel followed within hours, and Marcus's limited understanding of alien ship design was sufficient to recognize it as expensive, important, and definitely not a standard rescue craft. This, he thought while watching the Viren ship's elegant approach, is going to be complicated. The human shuttle landed first, and Marcus had maybe 10 minutes of warning. He used that time to help Silthara sit properly, to make sure her injured arm was supported, to try communicating through increasingly frantic gestures that more people were coming and they were friendly. Probably friendly. He hoped friendly. She seemed to understand, but her reaction surprised him. She became formal, adjusting her damaged clothing as best she could with one functional arm, sitting straighter despite obvious pain. It was the posture of someone preparing for judgment rather than rescue. The rescue team's reaction when they entered the cargo bay was immediate shock. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, leading the team, stopped dead in the entrance. Her eyes went wide, her hand moved unconsciously toward her sidearm before training overrode reflex. "Captain Webb," she said carefully, "is that a Viren in your cargo bay?" She was trapped in a crystal collapse. I couldn't leave her there. Chen was already speaking rapidly into her comm, her tone suggesting she was escalating to people well above her pay grade. Marcus caught fragments. Viren civilian, injured. Captain Webb provided medical assistance, requesting immediate diplomatic protocols. Marcus stood, deliberately placing himself between the rescue team and Silthara in a protective stance he didn't fully understand. She needed help, that's all that mattered. "Captain," Chen said slowly, "do you have any idea who?" She stopped, her expression suggesting she'd received new information through her comm. "Sir, we need to implement immediate diplomatic protocols. The Viren vessel is requesting confirmation of their—" She paused, listening. "They're calling her Radiance. Sir, I think we might have a significant situation." The situation's significance became clear when the Viren boarding party arrived. They were tall, elegant beings similar to Silthara, but wearing what Marcus recognized as military armor, ceremonial but functional, covered in symbols that probably meant something important to someone who understood Viren culture. Their reaction when they saw Silthara was immediate reverence. They dropped into synchronized bows so deep they were almost prostrations, their bodies arranged in postures that screamed royalty present in a language that needed no translation. The leader spoke in musical Viren, his tone carrying urgency and relief and barely controlled panic. Silthara responded, and her voice took on a quality Marcus hadn't heard before, command authority that made it clear whatever her normal status was, it was significantly higher than these soldiers. Commander James Rodriguez arrived next, a human diplomatic officer whose expression suggested he was aging in real time as he processed the situation. He carried a working translator, and when Silthara spoke again, the device rendered her words into precise English. "I am Silthara Vane, Radiant Empress of the Viren Ascendancy. I traveled to this system, investigating reports of hostile activity near our borders. My vessel was damaged by the solar storm. My guards were lost during our attempt to reach the surface. She looked directly at Marcus, and there was warmth in her expression that the formal translation couldn't diminish. This human found me trapped and dying. He risked his life to save mine, provided medical care without training in my species' physiology, and protected me during the storm's duration. I claim him under Virin custom as Kethva, one who has preserved royal life and is thereby granted honor protection. The translator provided a helpful footnote explaining that Kethva roughly translated as life bond guardian and carried significant legal and cultural weight in Virin society. Marcus, standing there in his damaged flight suit covered in alien blood and his own exhaustion, tried to process that he'd been performing field medicine on an actual empress. I didn't know. She was injured. Anyone would have done the same. No, Silthara said, and the translator caught the gentle certainty in her tone. Not anyone. You did. Without knowing my rank, without expecting reward, without hesitation. That is precisely why the title is granted. The diplomatic complications unfolded with impressive speed. Rodriguez pulled Marcus aside while Virin medical personnel examined their empress with technology that made human medicine look like folk remedies. Captain Webb, Rodriguez said quietly, do you understand what you've accidentally accomplished here? Human-Virin relations have been tense. Minimal contact, lots of mutual suspicion, decades of careful avoidance. You just saved their empress, their actual empress. I saved someone who was trapped. That she's an empress seems like information that would have been useful earlier. She was traveling incognito, investigating threats to her territory. The political implications are. Rodriguez ran his hand through his hair. You're about to become very famous, Captain, and very carefully watched by multiple intelligence services on both sides. Over the next week, while diplomatic teams worked out protocols for Silthara's return to Virin space, Marcus existed in strange limbo. He was officially a guest aboard the Steadfast, technically still on active duty, but practically speaking he'd become a diplomatic asset that no one quite knew how to handle. The Virin had requested, politely but very firmly, that he remain available for cultural exchange and formal recognition. Rodriguez translated this as, their empress wants you around, and we can't refuse without creating an incident. Marcus was given access to proper communication equipment, and finally filed his mission report, which he suspected would become required reading in first contact training programs. He also received briefings on Virin culture, crash courses in diplomatic protocol, and gentle suggestions that his life was going to be complicated for the foreseeable future. The surprising part was when Silthara requested a private meeting. She'd recovered significantly. Virin physiology apparently healed faster than human, and she received him in a chamber aboard her vessel, designated as neutral diplomatic space. She looked different now. The damaged clothing had been replaced with formal attire that looked like living artwork, flowing garments that shimmered with embedded technology, symbols of rank that Marcus couldn't interpret but recognized as significant. But her eyes were the same, luminous purple, carrying the same gaze that had watched him work in his cargo bay. Marcus Webb, she said, using his translator now, her voice carrying warmth beneath formality. I wanted to speak with you before I must return to my responsibilities, to thank you properly, now that I have words you can understand. You don't need to thank me. I did what anyone should do. But most would not. Especially not for an alien stranger, not when doing so risked your own survival. She moved closer. I have spent my reign trying to understand your species. We have studied human culture from distance, analyzed your histories, documented your expansion. Much of what we learned suggested you were concerning, aggressive, selfish, prone to conflict. We can be all of those things, Marcus admitted. Humans aren't perfect. But you can also be this. She gestured between them. Compassionate without condition, brave without audience, kind without expectation of return. You challenged everything I believed about your species, Marcus Webb. In saving my life, you may have saved something more important, the possibility of genuine understanding between our peoples. I'm just a survey captain. I map systems and file reports. I'm not a diplomat. You are Kethva. You are the human who carried an empress through fire expecting nothing. That matters more than any title. She paused. I would like to continue our acquaintance, if you permit it. Once diplomatic channels are properly established, I want to understand the species that could produce someone like you. Marcus thought about objecting that he wasn't special. But looking at her expression, he realized she was offering something significant, not just personal connection, but foundation for genuine cultural exchange. I'd like that, he said. Though I should warn you, most humans are more complicated than me. I'm kind of the simple one. Her laugh was musical. I suspect your simplicity is what made you wise enough to help without questioning. Sometimes the clearest path forward is the one we take without overthinking. The formal ceremonies followed, Marcus receiving recognition from both human and Viren authorities, becoming an unlikely symbol of peaceful first contact. But the real moment came when Silthara was preparing to depart and took his hand in the Viren gesture of honored farewell. "Thank you, Marcus Webb," she said in careful English she'd been learning. The accent was there, the grammar uncertain, but the meaning clear. "For seeing me when I was only person in need, for carrying me when I could not walk, for reminding me that kindness is not weakness." And Marcus, in his formal uniform that felt like costume, responded in the Viren phrases he'd learned. "Safe journey, radiant empress. May your path be clear." She smiled at his terrible pronunciation, corrected him gently, and then she was gone, back to her empire, her responsibilities, her political reality. Marcus was left wondering if that was the end of the strangest chapter of his life, or just the beginning of something he couldn't yet see coming. 6 months changed everything and nothing. Marcus returned to survey duty, though his assignments had subtly shifted, systems closer to Viren space, as if someone was keeping him conveniently positioned. Diplomatic channels opened. Regular meetings, cultural exchanges, trade negotiations. Everyone agreed the Empress's personal investment in human relations was driving unprecedented progress. Marcus received regular messages from Silthara, never through official channels, always through discreet diplomatic pouches. They started formal, updates on negotiations, expressions of gratitude. But gradually they became personal. Observations about leadership, questions about exploration, philosophical discussions that revealed the person beneath the title. He responded in kind, finding himself anticipating these exchanges. Someone interested in his perspective not because it was useful, but because she genuinely wanted to understand. They developed an unlikely friendship across the void, Empress and survey captain, united by shared experience neither could explain to their respective peoples. The invitation came after 6 months. Silthara requested he visit the Viren homeworld. "As Kethva, you are entitled to present yourself at the Radiant Court," her message explained. "But I ask you to come as my friend, as someone I would show my world to." Marcus accepted despite warnings from superiors about entanglement in Viren politics. He didn't care. Silthara had saved his sanity during those storm-trapped days as much as he'd saved her life. That meant something, still meant something. The Viren homeworld was breathtaking, civilization integrated into the planet rather than imposed upon it, technology serving beauty as much as function. Silthara greeted him personally at the orbital platform, an unprecedented honor her advisors clearly found concerning. "Marcus Webb," she said, using his full name like a title. "Welcome to Vireneth. I have much to show you." What followed were days that felt stolen from reality. Silthara showed him her world, not the official tour but the personal one. Gardens she retreated to when politics overwhelmed her, archives containing millennia of history. The chamber where she was crowned, which she admitted feeling both too large and too small for. They talked about leadership and loneliness, duty and choice, the isolation that came from positions separating you from normal connection. "I can tell my advisors anything," she said one evening overlooking a bioluminescent ocean, "but I cannot tell them everything. The weight of decisions I must make alone, the fear I will fail my people, the exhaustion of being symbol rather than person." She looked at him. "But I can tell you, because you already saw me vulnerable and chose compassion." Marcus shared his own isolation, years alone in space, choosing solitude because relationships required roots he'd never managed to establish. "I became a survey captain because mapping dead systems was simple, clear, no complications. And yet you complicated your life considerably by saving me. Best complication I ever signed up for." Their friendship deepened into something neither quite named but both recognized. The Virin court noticed, human intelligence noticed, but nothing crossed lines creating scandal. Not everyone was pleased. Factions existed who saw humanity as threat, Sulthara's openness as dangerous naivety, and humans who viewed Virin as competitors, cooperation as weakness. The conspiracy formed in shadows. The target wasn't Sulthara. Assassinating an empress would create martyrdom. The target was Marcus Webb, whose death could be framed as human internal conflict while eliminating the personal connection driving pro-human policies. Marcus became aware something was wrong when his security detail changed without explanation, when diplomatic schedules shifted unexpectedly. His military training, dormant but not forgotten, activated. He started watching differently, noting faces appearing too frequently. The attempt came during a cultural ceremony, massive gathering where Marcus was being formally recognized. Security was heavy but distributed. The assassins were professionals using Virin dissidents as cover. Marcus saw them moving through the crowd, recognized predatory focus marking them as threats. He was calculating exit routes when he realized their trajectory wasn't toward him. They were heading for the diplomatic platform, toward Sulthara, separated from her guards by ceremony protocols. The next 30 seconds unfolded with crystal clarity. Marcus pushed through the crowd, his body moving before his mind processed the decision. He reached Sulthara just as the first assassin did, physically putting himself between Empress and weapon. The blade, elegant, ceremonial-looking but lethal, punched through his diplomatic jacket into his chest, missing his heart by centimeters but causing immediate catastrophic damage. He felt Sulthara catch him as he fell, felt her weight as she covered him with her own body while her guards responded. Heard her voice, raw with emotion he'd never heard. "No, no, Marcus, stay with me, you cannot, I will not permit." The medical response was immediate. Virin technology far more advanced than human medicine, desperately trying to save his life. They stabilized him, transported him, deployed treatments his physiology wasn't designed for but which kept him breathing. Sulthara stayed beside him through all of it, abandoned formal duties, ignored advisors' protests, held his hand while medical staff worked, spoke to him when he couldn't respond, refused to leave. Marcus drifted in and out, each return bringing pieces, pain carefully managed, Sulthara's voice reading to him. Soft pressure of her hand, knowledge he was alive when he shouldn't be. He woke fully 3 days later. Sulthara was asleep in a chair beside his bed, still holding his hand, formal attire rumpled from days without rest. She looked exhausted and beautiful and more human than he'd ever seen her. When she realized he was awake, her composure cracked. She spoke in Virin too rapid for understanding, then switched to English. "You stupid, brave, impossible human. You were not the target. Intelligence we gathered, they were coming for you. You should have fled, should have let guards handle it. Should have let you die." Marcus's voice was rough, "Not really my style. You almost died yourself." "But I didn't." Viren medicine is very good at keeping idiotic humans alive. Marcus, she said his name like complete sentence, you saved my life twice now. Once when I was stranger, once when you were my friend, Marcus finished. Same reason both times you're worth saving. The aftermath was political earthquake. The assassination attempt traced to extremist factions in both species. Instead of destabilizing Empress's policies, Marcus's sacrifice galvanized support for cooperation, turned him into symbol of humanity's best. But for Marcus and Silthara, politics mattered less than personal revelation. What they'd built wasn't just friendship anymore. During one visit as Marcus recovered, Silthara spoke quietly. There is Viren custom for situations like ours. When two people have saved each other's lives, they are considered soul-bound, connected by debt transcending normal structures. It is rare, sacred, carrying obligations neither can ignore. Obligations like what? Like honoring the connection. Like acknowledging some bonds matter more than political convenience. Like admitting the human who carried me through fire has become someone I cannot imagine ruling without beside me. Marcus processed carefully. You're talking about something permanent, something complicating both our lives. I am talking about something true. Complications are secondary. He thought about the survey captain he was, solitary, simple, content mapping empty systems. Thought about who he'd become, someone who saved an empress twice, finding purpose beyond routine. Thought about Silthara, brilliant and lonely and brave enough to rebuild her understanding based on one act of compassion. All right, he said, let's be complicated together. In gardens of an alien world, under stars that weren't Earth's sun, a survey captain and empress figured out what soul-bound meant, not through ceremony, but through simple truth that they'd seen each other vulnerable and chosen, repeatedly, to stand together. Months later, Marcus held a new position, special liaison for human-Viren relations. Officially an advisor, practically Silthara's chosen presence in her inner circle. They navigated politics carefully, their relationship existing officially while growing deeper privately. During a formal state dinner celebrating the first major trade agreement, Silthara spoke publicly about the incident. I was dying beneath crystal. A human found me, not diplomat or politician, just a man who saw someone in need and chose compassion. He carried me through deadly terrain expecting nothing. When assassins targeted him, I covered his body with my own, returning protection he gave me. She looked at Marcus. This is what our peoples can be, not perfect, not without conflict, but willing to protect each other when it matters. Willing to